Go back one. Yep, right there. Back to this. Sorry, a lot of stuff going on. Let's see. I sent you the next one too. We'll get that in a second. All right, so follow that arc. We've been talking about the Israelites moving across the Jordan River to get into the Canaan, into the Promised Land, as God had instructed and directed them. That is what we talked about quite a bit, or that's what we. It is what we talked about. Excuse me, last week, and the memorial that was set up in the middle of the river as well. That the 12 stones that were there for a remembering of what God had done there at the Jordan River. The memorial that was set up on the east or the other side of the river once they got across as well. And the significance and the importance of those memorials, and that's what we talked about last week. That brought us now, is going to bring us now into verse number 2 of chapter 5, in which we see Israel submitting to God, right? So we're going to see some the reinstitution here of certain things that's going to happen now that the people are in the Promised Land. We see the Passover celebration being renewed as well, and then the blessings that are going to kind of display themselves here while they are in Canaan. So let's start there, in verse number 2 of Joshua chapter 5, and we'll read down to verse number 9 and start the first part of this here reinstitution of the signs of the covenant here. So verse 2, and the Lord said unto Joshua, make these sharp knives and circumcise again the children of Israel a second time. And Joshua made him sharp knives and circumcised the children of Israel to heal his foreskins. And this is the cause why Joshua did circumcise, so that all the people that came out of Egypt that were males, even all the men of war, died in the wilderness by the way after they came out of Egypt. Now all the people that came out were circumcised, but all the people that were born in the wilderness by the way as they came forth out of Egypt, them they had not circumcised. So the children of Israel walked for 40 years in the wilderness till all the people that were men of war which came out of Egypt were consumed because they obeyed not the voice of the Lord, unto whom the Lord sware that he would not show them the land which the Lord sware to the fathers that he would give us, a land that floweth with milk and honey. And their children whom he raised up in their stead, them Joshua circumcised, for they were uncircumcised because they had not circumcised them by the way. And it came to pass, when they had done the circumcising all the people, that they abode in their place in the camp till they were whole. And the Lord said unto Joshua, this day I have rolled away the reproach of Egypt from off of you. Wherefore the name of this place is called Gilgal until this day. So, first thing here, right? So once now we've crossed the Jordan River, we're now in the Promised Land, the land of promise, and God had told them they're going to have many moons ago. They finally now are realizing this promise in the land of Canaan, and God instructs Joshua, once all the people have got there, to reinstitute the circumcision, right? And we know that this circumcision was a sign of the Abrahamic covenant, okay? And the Abrahamic covenant, Genesis chapter 12, right? Yes, somewhere in the 15 maybe. Anyways, Genesis, Abrahamic covenant, I promised you land, right? What else? What else is in the Abrahamic covenant? Land, people, and the Messiah, right? And from your seed. That's what the Abrahamic covenant is. So this process, institution of this covenant of circumcision was important because that's an important command for them to follow, Genesis 17. Because if anyone that was not circumcised is now in violation of that covenant, okay? which would have been the case here for pretty much all of the Israelites, right? Because all of the males that were born after Israel had left Egypt, we see verses 3 through 6 of Joshua chapter 5, we see here that once they got into Egypt, right, the wilderness, they had not been circumcised, okay? So Israel had to carry out this circumcision in order to rightfully claim the covenant. Okay, and since the Abrahamic covenant was like pretty much intertwined with the Promised Land, right? The sign of the Abrahamic covenant of circumcision had to. It makes sense that this would have been reinstated once the people were in the Promised Land. Okay, so that's why God had Joshua, or instructed Joshua to do this, okay? Now, God had previously called for the reinstitution of this covenant when he confronted Moses back in Exodus chapter 4. Okay, now when God confronts Moses in Exodus chapter 4, and he's seeking here to kill him if Moses did not circumcise his son. All right, in Exodus chapter 4, Moses' wife, Zipporah, right, reluctantly does the deed herself while God detains Moses. God's demand that his people be personally identified with his covenant for them. God's people were for him, therefore circumcision was a matter of faith in God and obedience to him. Being circumcised shows Israel served God's purposes and were dependent on him. Wandering around in the wilderness for 40 years, this thing, right? This wasn't happening. Okay. Now they're in the Promised Land. This shows a fulfillment, right, of a promise here. So the Israelites needed to reinstate this law, I don't know what to call it, law thing that they did, right, to show that they were dependent on God. Okay, so Israel obeying God and circumcised the generations that had been born both during the wilderness wanderings, and the fact that circumcision obviously made them vulnerable for attack, right, for several days. That was not a problem for God, right? So you got to think, right here, 40 years worth of people, right, that had not had the circumcision, now have the circumcision. So that's a big swath of the population that's going to take some time to recover from this, okay? So that's why we see them there. They had to stay in Gilgal until they were restored, made whole again. And, God made Israel's enemies fearful of Israel, right? We saw that last chapter already with the people who were in Jericho were already scared of the Israelites for what they were able to do, what God had done through them. So the enemies, this was an opportunity for the enemies to come down and do some damage to them. They did not. They didn't even leave their cities because they were fearful of being killed by Israel's God, okay? So that means Israel's presence in the Promised Land as God's people now signaled the rolling away of what verse number 9 calls the reproach of Egypt. Right? Them being there signals the rolling away of this reproach of Egypt. Now, why is it described in verse number 9 of chapter 5 as the reproach of Egypt? Now, probably this reproach was probably the ridicule, right? The reputation that the Egyptians tried to give Israel for not taking the Promised Land at Kadesh Barnea nearly 40 years previously. Okay, from the Egyptian perspective, right, it appeared as if a wandering in the wilderness people was essentially the best that God could do for Israel, right? How many people? What's the population of Israel as they're wandering around the wilderness? A lot or a little? A lot, right? Would you have, these other cities that were around and they're in the wilderness, would you have known that there was a migrating people out there for 40 years? You would have watched, right? You would have known, what in the world are they doing? Like, what are they doing, right? Why are they still doing this? People knew that the Israelites were wandering around the wilderness, right? It wasn't just the Israelites out there by themselves. Other nations knew they were out there, right? And they were supposed to take the promised land over. They got to the point they were going to. They didn't go in, right? So Egypt here let off the reputation that not only was Israel weak, but Israel's God was weak because they couldn't take the promised land like they said they were going to. They're going to go over and take this Canaan land. They didn't do it, right? So now they're in there. This is rolling back that reputation of Israel like being a nomadic people who had nobody to serve and not a God that was not very powerful. Okay? That's why this is a big deal. This is happening, and why he reinstates this decree here of circumcision. Now, the ridicule essentially is going to end. God's people were in the land, fulfilling what God had intended them since before He even called Abraham out of Ur and of the Chaldeans. Okay, so we see the reinstitution of the sign of the covenant. Verse 10, we see also the renewal here of the Passover celebration as well. Okay, so there's verse number 10. And the children of Israel encamped in Gilgal and kept the Passover on the 14th day of the month, at even in the plains of Jericho, and they did eat of the old corn on the land of the morrow after the Passover, unleavened cakes and parched corn in the self-same day. So reinstituting here the sign of the covenant also paves the way for a renewal of the Passover celebration. Okay, and we are fully aware of what the Passover celebration was. Angel of death came in, right? They put the blood of the lamb across the door frames and passed over. Death passed over, and their firstborn were not killed because of it, and it was obviously a huge deal because that's what eventually led Pharaoh to allow them to leave. It was a celebration here that needed to be honored and recognized, and this was also part of Israel's ceremonial law, right? No uncircumcised male was allowed to take place in the Passover feast. All right, so these two things kind of go hand in hand here. This celebration of the Passover, vivid reminder of God's grace to Israel protecting them. All right, that's what this is. Israel owed God a debt of gratitude for that night of deliverance, and He provided them with a substitute in allowing their firstborns to live. All right, so having circumcised, reinstituted, having the renewal of the Passover celebration, having both of these things, why is this an important thing for the Israelites in understanding their relationship with God? Why does God take time here in chapter 5 to get Joshua to reinstate these things? Especially considering Israel's relationship with God. Why is this important? Okay, yeah. What else? It's an important little thing here I want to bring out. Anybody know why this is a big deal?
He was successful in conquering Egypt, and now he's about to be successful in the land of Canaan.
Okay. Yes, both those things are true. Both things are very good answers.
You can also say the Lord.
There we go, right? So what this does, right? What this does for the Israelites, right? You got to think about the actual, like, flesh and blood people that are there, right? They're just common people. They're us, right? That's what they are. This process of the circumcision and then going through and renewing the Passover and making sure this thing is taking place, is that it's, for 40 years, these people wandering around, right? This now gives the Israelites a renewal in their sense of belonging to God, right? this sets them apart to God. They have these things that they do that are different than all these other nations, right, because of who they serve. So that makes them more, it renews their sense of belonging to God while they are in the promised land. Okay, so it's a kind of a renewal or refreshing of who they are in God. All right, last things, 11 and 12 of chapter 5 for this lesson here is that the realization is the blessing. So we'll see there, we saw there already, verses 11 to 8, the old corn, the lamb, and the morrow. After the Passover, unleavened cakes, parched corn the self-same day, and the manna ceased on the morrow. After they had eaten of the old corn of the land, neither had the children of Israel manna anymore. But they did eat the fruit of the land of Canaan that year. Right? So once in the land, no more need for manna. They're not wandering around the wilderness anymore. So the manna stops. And the people ate some of the grains, corn that we see here that was around them. So this was essentially the first meal in the promised land was not manna. Right? Now it seems, right, that and it kind of seems like the Israelites are essentially eating the Canaanites' grain. But in actuality, Israel's grain was what the Canaanites had been eating all along. Right? So this was their promise. This is the bounty that God had given them. So the Israelites here could have rightfully said that this is our grain from our God. Look what our God did for us in making us His people. Soon show up, there's stuff for us to eat. Right? So a big deal that they are able to do that. What would have maybe been some of the regrets that the Israelites have had as they are partaking in this first meal of Canaan? What would some of maybe the regrets have been as they're enjoying the bounty that is around them?
All the complaining.
Right, all of the complaining, absolutely. What else, if you were there and you're eating of this grain, what would have been maybe some of the regrets or things you would have been thinking about?
The doubt.
The doubt, the rejection, right, of grandma and grandpa and great-grandma and great-grandpa of the promised land that had happened, 40 years previously. Being God's people, tremendous blessing for Israel. Therefore, eating the fruit of the land there in Canaan was essentially their first taste of victory. Go ahead, Jay, bring up the last thing. All right, so this kind of finishes up lesson 5. We're not done. We're going to keep going here in verse number 13. But I did want to show you this. As lesson 5 comes to a conclusion, your God's faithfulness, He's going to faithfully lead us, just like He is the Israelites, by His grace. It's kind of the theme there for the 5th. Right, so that brings us into lesson number 6, and we have plenty of time. So we're going to jump right into it. So it starts right in verse number 13. As he works to kind of bring that up there. Now we have lessons from around Jericho, right? That's what's going to happen now as we get into verse number 13, as you see there. And it came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho, his first city that he comes to, that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, there stood a man over against him with his sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went unto him, and said unto him, Art thou for us, or for our adversaries? And he said, Nay, but as the captain of the host of the Lord, I am now come. And Joshua fell on his face to the earth, and did worship, and said unto him, What saith my Lord unto his servant? And the captain of the Lord's host said unto Joshua, Loose thy shoe from thy foot, for the place whereon thou standest is holy. And Joshua did just so. Right? So we get into some lessons here from Jericho, and we see, first of all, that God is going to faithfully encourage the Israelites. He's going to start off with Joshua, and he's going to prove himself faithful to Israel by encouraging, first first of all, the leader, that we see here with Joshua, and then giving them these very unique plans for the destruction of Jericho. Okay? Now, we know these plans, very unique, right, are infused specifically with a strong belief that God would be faithful to his promises, right? That's what this is all about. So, we see here Joshua, God displaying tremendous wisdom in preparing the Israelites for their first attack, maiden voyage here, of going in and taking over these heathenites here all throughout the land of Canaan. And he couldn't have done more to communicate to them that he is faithful to his promise. You could actually say that God attacked in the battle, or that when God actually attacked in the Battle of Jericho, there would have been no doubt, no hesitation in the hearts and the minds of his people. Because when he gives them the battle plan and specifically infuses it with courage and belief in him, God's wisdom and power here, showing such great display of spurring them on to courageously go through and do whatever. Right? So we get again here, verse 13. Joshua, as the leader of these people, walks up on the walls of Jericho. Now we mentioned this a couple times before, but I want to bring it up to you again. Hasn't been that long ago they had did some archaeological investigations around where they think Jericho was, and have seen some of the foundations of where they think the wall would have been. We know that those walls eventually do what? All the way down. When God does something, he does it what? Totally, right? So even before the foundations, most of the time he brings something down, the foundation is still on the ground. This was not the case for Jericho, where they think Jericho was at. But they have found rubbles of what they think was this one-time city, and they have had evidence of huge walls that were very wide. They have evidence of these huge watchtowers as well that were located at the corners of these walls, and it was some of what they think some of the largest watchtowers, thickest walls in all of this area as they are kind of going through and doing some of these archaeological digs. Okay, so we can see firsthand actual physical evidence that Jericho was a real place that was totally destroyed, and the archaeologists have done some digging to show that. Okay, now we can go back to the history here of Joshua seeing this city, walking up on these walls, and seeing this huge, essentially fortress that's there, and he's looking at it because he knows that he's contemplating here. Probably how in the world are we going to attack this place, right? Joshua, godly man, absolutely. Completely righteous, absolutely, right? But Joshua yet still just a man, right? He's in charge of these armies and in charge of these people, and God's told him to go conquer that place. So any good leader, general does, he goes up and thinks, how are we going to do this, right? That's what he's doing. So he's staring, looking at the walls of Jericho, contemplating the attack, and then a stranger silently appears out of nowhere. Okay? And not only does that probably startle Joshua, somebody just kind of appears, but the stranger also is doing what? Verse 13 and 14 tells us what? He's got a sword. And it's not in its sheath. It's what? In his hand. Ready to fight. Right? Ready for battle. And Joshua, cautiously, I'm sure, kind of walks up to this gentleman that he sees, and his first question there is what? At the end of verse 13, Joshua walks up to him and says to him what? Friend or foe, right? Friendly or not friendly? Pretty good question for Joshua, right? Makes sense. If we see somebody with a sword, as you are looking at the city you're about to attack, good question. Hey, are we gonna have to fight this out right now, or are you for us? Okay. This obviously would have unnerved Joshua. This would have unnerved any of us, right? It would have probably scared any of us. Would his leadership of Israel end so quickly at the hands of just one enemy soldier who had snuck up on him and kind of, got the best of him? It would be a pretty quick way to end Joshua's career here. But to his relief, of course, the stranger revealed himself not just as any other soldier, but verse 14 tells us that this wasn't just regular soldier. It was what? Okay, so it was the person in charge of whose army? God's army. Okay, person in charge of God's army. Captain of the host of the Lord. Now, Joshua communicated with God regularly. Right, we've seen it happen. Communicated with him regularly. But the appearance of the Lord standing before him, right? What would that have done for Joshua's plans as he's standing there looking at Jericho? Now we know that Joshua communicated with God a lot, but having him essentially in front of you, what would that have done for Joshua's heart and mind? What would it have done for your heart and mind? We're getting ready to go to the battle. Let's just try to make this as real as possible, right? This is a supernatural thing that happened, but we got to make it a natural thing, right? Joshua is there. He's a regular dude. He's looking at this huge city, thinking, how are we going to fight this place? This guy shows up out of nowhere with a sword. Joshua obviously knows he's a soldier. Probably looks the part, right? Got a sword in his hand. Oh no, I'm going to die. Joshua says, friend or foe. He doesn't just say friend, he says, I'm the guy that's in charge of the army of the Lord. What would this have done for you?
It would have emboldened me.
Absolutely, right? I got that. Well, let's go right now. Let me go get my sword. Me and you go take the thing on, right? I think I would have been the same way. Right? This would have greatly encouraged and infused his mind with unbelievable strength. God has appeared in front of Joshua as evidence where he was probably maybe wavering a little bit in faith. It doesn't say that, but he was thinking, how in the world are we going to do this, right? He had to have had that thought. And as he's having that thought, God's man shows up with a sword in front of him, seeing the captain of the host of the Lord. Verse 14 then, we see, Captain of the Lord, I am now come. We see Joshua's response, right? And Joshua fell on his face to the earth and did worship and said unto him, what does the Lord say to his servant? So we see the immediate response of Joshua. It wasn't like to go get his sword and take this guy and let's go fight. Probably would have been my response. But Joshua, we see instantly showing his faith, his humbleness, his submissiveness to God, drops down on his knees and wants to know what saith my Lord unto his servant. We see Joshua here showing himself as a willing servant. A real question here, what might have you asked in this same situation? If you're Joshua here and this happens, what would you have asked or done in this situation? Anybody want to give me an honest response? I can tell you what Lance would have done. This would not have been my response. I wish I could stand up here and tell you that I would have dropped to my knees and been like this humble servant willing to do whatever. But it would have probably been like high five, let's go. Right? Me and this guy are gonna do this. And God's gonna use me. I would like to, maybe I would have dropped to my knees, but I can see me being like, hey, this is party time. Let's go. There's nobody can stop me. I've got God's arm man with me, right? But that was not Joshua's response. We see him realizing how insignificant he was in this whole plan. He's just a vessel that God is going to use to do whatever, and he willingly would have done whatever, right? If this guy would have told Joshua, say, what I need you to do, I need you to go back, and while I take care of this, you make sure the porta potties are cleaned up. Joshua, yes sir, right? He would have went right to the porta potties and started cleaning, because that's what God would have wanted him to do, and he done it happily. So we see the response of Joshua, excuse me, being willing to do and seeking God's direction. He didn't complain. He didn't whine. He wasn't mad. This guy was essentially showed up to be in charge of stuff. We don't see any of that from Joshua. He wanted simply to know that he was totally open to whatever God would have him to do. Joshua calling himself a servant, not a slip of the tongue here, not a nice touch in the presence of the Lord. Joshua recognizes that though he is the most important person among God's people there in Canaan, he was nothing more than primarily just a servant for God. That was it. God had appointed Joshua to do God's work. Joshua was going to do whatever it took. He ranked under God in the chain of command. What are some characteristics of a good servant? What are characteristics of a good servant? That's a question for you all. What are the traits or characteristics, sometimes I talk fast, of a good servant? Humble. Obedient.
They're loyal.
Willing to serve. Submissive. A good servant seeks to know his master's will and then faithfully carries out the duties required of his master. Right? He trusts the master. There's no room for pride or resentment in the heart of a true servant. So while the drawn sword here in the Lord's hand was at first a threat, it immediately becomes a source of encouragement for Joshua. The words that he used, the host of the Lord, in verse 14, also signify to Joshua that also signifies to Joshua that the Lord's had a mass of warriors that were with him, unseen. Joshua couldn't see them, obviously. But not only were they unseen, not only was there a whole bunch of them, but they also, swords drawn, ready for battle. The Lord's promise that God gave Joshua over in chapter 1, and I want you to flip back over there. We're going to come back to this verse a lot throughout this. But verse 5 of chapter 1, God is telling Joshua this: there shall not any man be able to stand before thee all the days of thy life. Because I was with Moses, so I'll be with thee. I will not fail or forsake or forget, right? Not going to fail you, not going to forget you. So those that promise that God gave Joshua, that came just flying, rushing back into his head, right? As he begins to think, if this guy can show up with a sword, how many more of these guys are around me that I don't know about? This would have made this promise to Joshua very real, right? Yet God said this, sure. Joshua believed it, absolutely. He led them across the promise, into the promised land, across the Jordan River. But now rubber meets the road. We've got to start fighting. All right, this is Yes, crossing the Jordan River was amazing. Sure, God had done that before with the Red Sea, right? This was Joshua's experience of a Red Sea crossing, essentially. Am I downplaying that? No. But you can see where Joshua's like, hey, this is how Moses felt, right? You can kind of see that, right? Now, though, like, we got to start fighting people. And they're going to try to kill us, too. So you can see Joshua's mind beginning to turn here. Not doubt, but worry. Absolutely. We get it. And in the midst of all that, now God reinstills the faith of Joshua, encourages him by making this promise of verse 5 of chapter 1. He has now seen physical evidence of this host of army that is on his side. Any doubts, any anxiety that he had shifted completely, right, to encouragement to God. Over in 2 Kings chapter 6, don't flip over there, but we see another example of this host of God's army standing on behalf of Elisha. Right, this chapter 6 of 2 Kings, verses 8 through 17. God reveals also to Elisha the host of armies for his servant. And Elisha, again, as well, finds great comfort in the great danger that he is facing as well. All right, so we see, first of all, lessons from around Jericho. We're going to get into more of this next week, but God's faithfully encouraging Joshua, first of all, by showing that, hey, I got you. Right? We'll move into verse 15 and down through chapter 6. Next week, he doesn't give him any specific instructions yet of how to do this, but he encourages him further by telling him to take his shoes off because he's standing on holy ground. But we'll get into that more next week. Let's pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for this lesson, for this time we can look into your word, Lord, and be able to see the faithfulness, Lord, that you gave unto your servant Joshua, and how you encouraged him in the midst of probably a moment for him that was filled with a little worry and concern. But you, as you always do, in your sovereignty, Lord, knew what he needed and displayed it perfectly into him, Lord. And then as we continue to see the encouragements that you give Joshua and Israel, Lord, as they prepare for battle, Lord, we are reminded that the same God that showed up with a host of people, angels, armies, whatever for Joshua, the same God that we serve today. The anxieties, the fears, the worries, the things that we have that fill our lives as well. We need to remember, Lord, that faithfully serving you allows us to remove those worries or concerns, Lord, because we can understand and come to the realization that you are in control of the provisions of our life, Lord. In turn, makes us be faithful to you, be faithful to us, and the cycle continues, Lord. So I pray, Lord, that is the desire of our hearts. Just want to pray, Pastor Rob, here as he comes the next little bit as well. We have our service today, that you'll use him, keep us attentive to your word as well. In your name I pray. Amen.